When you walked in a mine, you never knew whether or not you would walk out again, whether you would be crushed by a roof fall or whether you'd be blown apart by an explosion. So you were living in a perpetual state of being threatened with violent death.
Danger was literally in the air in the mines, in the form of noxious gases called damps. A buildup of afterdamp could asphyxiate miners. Methane-heavy fire damp, when sparked by something as simple as a miner's lamp, could cause explosions big enough to kill men scattered through miles of interconnected tunnels.
Coal operators were very cavalier about accidents and what caused them. The assumption was that mining is just inherently dangerous and that's just part of it. You're lucky you have a job anyway, and so we're just going to go about business as usual.
Coal operators were able to block most mine safety legislation by arguing that regulations would be too costly. The few safety laws on the books were rarely enforced. West Virginia's coal mines had a higher death rate than any other state in the Union in the first decade of the 20th century. And in 1907, West Virginia suffered the single largest mining disaster in the nation's history.
There was no one ever prosecuted for any of these hundreds and hundreds of deaths. There was a sense of fatalism, I think, among the miners in West Virginia about what government could do to protect them, which helps explain their passion for the union. The sense of, we have to take care of ourselves. We have to create an organization that's so powerful that it will protect our lives as well as our standard of living.
In the 10 years after the failed strike of 1902, little had changed in the working conditions of southern West Virginia miners. The United Mine Workers had made few inroads. More than 90% of the miners had no union in the spring of 1912, when long-simmering tensions began to boil over once again. Frank Keeney was out in front this time. The 29-year-old had convinced a few thousand miners on Cabin Creek to stand up and make specific demands of their employers. They wanted out from under the financial burdens of the company's store and the long ton, an end to the mine guard system, and formal recognition of their union. The owners responded by firing Keeney and his comrades and putting them and their families out of their homes. More than 2 months later, the families were still living in tents with little hope for success.
In the summer of 1912, Keeney's wife, Bessie, was 8 months pregnant. His kids were sick. They don't have enough food to feed their children. 300 Baldwin Felts detectives had set up machine gun emplacements all around Cabin Creek. So this was when they were at their most desperate hour.
Keeney saw little choice but to make the difficult 20-mile trip to Charleston to beseech the leaders in the UMW district office to come to the aid of his sagging miners. The local officers said they had their hands full. The Union treasury was already depleted by a strike at Paint Creek, just across the ridge from Cabin Creek. The Paint Creek strike had turned deadly. UMW officials told Keeney he was on his own.
He cusses them out and says that he'll take control of the strike himself. And then says, if you're afraid to go to Cabin Creek, I'll find a woman who will go.
Mother Jones heard the knock on her hotel room door in Charleston that muggy July night and found Frank Keeney standing outside with tears in his eyes, she recalled. I can't get anyone to go to Cabin Creek, he told her. The national officers say they don't want to get killed. I'll come up, Jones told Keeney. I've been thinking of invading that place for some time. On August 6, 1912, Mother Jones arrived in Keeney's hometown, the only town in Cabin Creek not controlled by a coal operator. Keeney had gathered a big crowd. They all wanted to see the woman known as the miner's angel.
She was kind of a rock star of the labor movement by then. People would reach out to her, their arms would reach out, as though they were in a religious revival. They want to believe in themselves, and she assures them that she's ready to fight with them and that they are capable of fighting.
The morning after Mother Jones's speech, miners up and down Cabin Creek began to walk off the job. A week later, more than 3,000 marchers pushed through armed militiamen and followed Mother Jones and Frank Keeney to a rally on the steps of the Capitol. They were there to persuade Governor William Glasscock to abolish the mine guard system. Mother Jones issued an ominous warning. Unless the governor rids Paint Creek and Cabin Creek of these goddamn Baldwin Felts mine guard thugs, there's going to be one hell of a lot of bloodletting in these hills. Governor Glasscock believed that the fight between coal companies and their employees was a private matter, and that he lacked authority to step in. Frank Keeney decided it was time to change tactics. If the state would not protect miners and their families, they would protect themselves.
Keeney had a certain kind of charisma and a certain kind of certainty about what to do, and a sense of either recklessness or courage, depending on how you look at it, of leading his people to the brink of a cliff and facing the consequences that come from fighting.
Strikers began buying guns, while sympathetic miners from nearby coal camps smuggled weapons and ammunition into Paint Creek and Cabin Creek. They stashed rifles, pistols, bullets, gunpowder, and dynamite in the woods.
Miners organized themselves into groups that would be ready to go on a moment's notice in case of an attack on the tent colony by mine guards. You also had another group called the Dirty 11, and the Dirty 11 were responsible for some of the more brutal acts of violence that took place. The miners were dynamiting tipples, dynamiting railroad tracks, firing on trains. Anything that they could do to stop production, and anything they could do to kill a mine guard.
Paint Creek, Cabin Creek strike was an explosion of rage. For 2 decades, the coal companies used mine guards to keep the miners in submission through use of terror. Now the miners learned to employ violence themselves to fight back, to show the coal companies the terror was a two-edged sword.
After some of the mine guards were killed, miners pasted notes on the coffins saying, "Gone to hell, more to go." That streak of vindictiveness demonstrates the harsh feelings that had built up over decades of mistreatment.
By early September, it looked like civil war was breaking out within 30 miles of the state capitol. Glasscock, bowing to public pressure, finally stepped in. He declared martial law in the coal fields of Paint Creek and Cabin Creek and sent in 1,200 West Virginia National Guardsmen to disarm the combatants on both sides. The troops confiscated more than 2,000 rifles and revolvers. 225,000 rounds of ammunition, and 6 machine guns. Once the worst of the fighting had been checked, the governor encouraged the antagonists to sit down and work out a truce. The UMW agreed to negotiate. The owners refused.
The production of coal was always a low margin of profit business. And every penny for every ton, from the perspective of the coal operators, they needed to maximize that margin as much as they possibly could. And this, of course, meant to the operators, we cannot afford to give an inch.
Mine owners embarked on a vigorous campaign to import strikebreakers from New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, St. Louis, and the Deep South. Transportation men, as they were called, poured into the area on armed trains, often under the protection of National Guardsmen. Strikers and their wives were often waiting to confront the transportation men when they disembarked at depots near Paint Creek and Cabin Creek. My Aunt Nellie stomped a strikebreaker in the face with her high heels and tore his ears loose and knocked his teeth out, just about killed him, one woman remembered. She was just a little thing and pregnant, but she could fight and cuss good enough to be a man.
The women involved in labor strife, they have everything at stake. The survival of their families is at stake. They're going to be the ones who provide much of the support network to keep the strike going. Oftentimes standing up to company guards. My grandmother and my mother, they would say there's nothing more vicious than a woman on the strike line.
Usually the women would gather outside the mine in mass and try to keep the scabs from going in. Armed not with guns, but with household utensils.
African Americans are fully engaged in the strike. They meet the trains carrying strike breakers. Dan Chain, alias Few Clothes Johnson, was a very effective organizer and fearless. He was very good with a gun and a fist. It didn't matter if they were black or white, the strike breakers. They were strike breakers. This is not a race matter, this is a class matter. I don't mean that this is some kind of utopian place, an egalitarian paradise or something. It's not. But it's just that there are more pressing matters right now.
The coal operators, they felt that there was no chance those groups would cooperate. But no matter how segregated it is, you can't live in a coal camp without getting to know people. You know, everybody shops at the company store. The men all socialize underground. Nobody can see anybody's ethnicity because everybody's covered in coal dust. And so after a period of time, you get to know each other. You see a huge ethnic diversity coming together in those conflicts.
At Christmas time, 1912, as the strike headed into its 8th month, Mother Jones made a visit to the camps in southern West Virginia, delivering shoes, clothes, and presents for children. Frank and Bessie Keeney